So we are in week 3 of our Who Would Jesus Vote For series, and hopefully you've had a chance to listen to the first 2 sermons. If you haven't, those are online, and you can listen to those there. But we saw a couple things. First, we saw that there's a difference between governmental mandates and individual mandates in the Bible. There's different things that we're responsible for. And the other thing we saw was that God would care about people first, and so we would do the same thing as well. And today, we're going to look at something that is foundational in our understanding of how God has designed us. And there is one thing, if there is one thing I believe that is essential in this idea of Christianity, it is the concept of free will. God has given us choices, and I believe that's what the founding fathers of our country believed as well, that freedom and liberty and choice are a fundamental right for everybody, and that God created that from the very beginning. And we are blessed to live in a country with choices. We are blessed. I mean, when you leave here today and you decide that you're going to go eat lunch somewhere, you have a bunch of choices, especially here in Lebanon. Lots of choices. Now, I don't know how good some of those choices are, but you have choices. You have all kinds of things that you might want. We get a lot of choices. And we're even more blessed that we have a God that allows freedom, that allows us to choose Him in our lives. We get to choose whether we want to accept Him or not. Nobody was forced to come here today unless you're maybe under the age of 18. My family was forced. My boys always have to come. But as adults, you were not forced to come this morning. You got to choose. We get to choose whether we accept Him. We get to choose the focus of our life. We get to choose if we want to put Him first in our life or not. God has given us enough freedom because He loves us. He loves us. There's a song by George Jones he sung, and I'm not sure if it was original with him. I didn't do the research. But he sung it, and it was called Choices. The chorus goes like this. I'm not going to sing it for you. I'm going to read it. Trust me, you don't want that. It goes like this. I've had choices since the day I was born. There were voices that told me right from wrong. If I had listened, no, I wouldn't be here today, living and dying with the choices I made. And that's true. We have choices every day that affect our future. God gave us that freedom to choose between right and wrong, to choose what we will do today, and what we do today affects tomorrow. Let me read just a few references in the Bible that shows us how God has allowed us to have choices and to choose. Starting with this famous verse. I know you've heard it before, Joshua 24:15. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. You see, God gives us free will. He lets us choose who we will serve. And we get to choose who that is. God is not forcing you to follow Him. Everything you do in the name of God or what you do against God is a choice who we serve. It's up to you, He says. John 7:17 says this, anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. And that's Jesus saying that. He says, basically, when we choose to follow God, we will see that God works. When you follow Him, it will work in your life, and you will see that what Jesus said was true. When we choose Christianity, it works, and we can choose to follow God or not. James 4:4 says this, you adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. We get to choose who our friends are. And he's saying here, are we friends with the world, which is basically sin, or are we friends with God? We get to choose which side we are on. We get to choose if we want to be enemies with God. 1 Peter 4:3 doesn't actually have the word choose in there, but I'll explain it in a minute. It says this, for you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do. Actually, it doesn't choose, sorry. Living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. God wants us to choose to get out of the sin and move towards Him. He wants us to not choose the way of evil. And Philippians 4:8 says this, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. He gives us choices. We get to choose what runs through our mind. The reason I read through all of these is because I want us to understand your life is up to you. It's up to you. God is not some giant marionette puppeteer with these little strings attached to you, making you do things and making things happen so that you have to do that. God has given us choice. He has given us free will. We get to choose what we are going to do. And here's the thing. God has decided that individual responsibility is a core to being a citizen of heaven. That is core. We are citizens of heaven. We have individual responsibility. And if we have that, it's core for being a citizen of heaven, then it's central for everyone. Because God's plan is right for everyone. So what does that individual responsibility mean for us as citizens of heaven and current residents of America? How does that play out in how we vote and how we live? Because I don't know about you, but lots of people like to blame other things in life. I even do. I even like to blame. We all do that. It was this, there was that. And we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. But what does individual responsibility look like if I'm a citizen of heaven? Well, here's the first thing we have to understand. That because of our freedom to choose and our freedom of choice, we are the reason for our problems. We are the reasons for our problems. It's not the government or anyone else. And I realize I'm probably preaching to the choir about this. Many of us understand that already. But it's important for us to look at it. Now, I know that there are bad things that happen in life that are not your fault. There are things like that. There are things like sickness. There are things like cancer. There are things like death. But even in the idea of death, sometimes it's because somebody else made a poor choice. You see, choices make a big difference. We live in a fallen world, and those things are terrible. But the reality is, if you think about your life, most of the problems you've occurred are by your choices. It's what you have chosen to do. I mean, we're subject to uncertainties like sickness, but even in the realms of sickness, we have choices. I mean, we can wash our hands, we can take our vitamins, we can go to the doctor regularly, we can do all of those things, and those help us. But many of the things that we have issues with are the result of what we've chosen. I mean, how often have you heard someone complain about the situation they are in and they've put themselves there? Maybe it was you in the mirror. How often do we complain about where we're at in life and all these things, and we're the ones that put us there? You know, the people who are sick all the time, but they only eat junk food, they never exercise, and they smoke a lot. Of course you're sick. That's what's going to happen. Or the ones who say this, I just don't have enough money for my rent. Well, you probably shouldn't have bought an $800 iPhone. You see, we put ourselves by our choices in situations. I see this one a lot. We have people come to the church. I can't afford gas for my car, and some are legitimate, but some of them, I want to say to them, well, if you stop smoking 2 packs a day, you could drive wherever you wanted to go. I don't say that. That's what I would want to say. And I know that may sound mean, but it is simply a mirror being brought up before people. That way, maybe they can understand how their choices put them in the situation they are in. People are free to do whatever they want, but that doesn't mean that other people are responsible to pay for or to deal with their bad choices. Just because they chose to spend $800 on an iPhone doesn't mean that I am responsible to help them with their rent. You see, we have choices. We get to make choices all the time about what we will do. Where we are spiritually and personally is the result of what we have chosen. I know that's hard to hear. It's hard for me to write this. When I was writing this, I thought to myself, I don't have anybody else to blame. I want to blame somebody else. For whatever is going wrong, I would prefer somebody else take this on them. But there's certain aspects of my life I wish I had done better. I wish that I had done differently. Especially whenever I was younger. I mean, most of us, a lot of us, when we were younger, we probably had a lot of discretionary income compared to what we have now. And we think to ourselves, if I had been wiser and had not chosen to go eat out all the time and go do stuff all the time, what could I have done with that discretionary income? There's lots of choices that we have made that we wish we hadn't, but we only have one place to look. And whether that choice ends up in a positive place or a negative place, I'm the one that did it. And none of us really like to admit that we made a mistake or a poor choice. And when you are a parent, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Not me has done a lot of stuff in my house. I can never get to the bottom of an actual issue because it's always, they did this. They started this. And you know the look on your kid's face when they know they made a bad choice. You know, I've got a couple of pictures here to show you. So this one right here, this is Yogurt Head. When they chose to take the yogurt, spread it all over the table in their face and their body. That's the look of, what? I didn't do anything. Not me. We have another one here. This is Pancake Boy. He pulled all the pancakes off the thing, put them on the floor, and he's looking at me like, I just wanted a pancake. I just wanted something to, you know that look from your kids when it's not me, it's somebody else. I didn't do this. The reason I had kids, honestly, was so I had sermon illustrations, just so you guys know. But we all mess up, and we all want somebody else to blame. We don't want anybody looking at us. We want to blame somebody else. They made me do it. I hear this one a lot. If they hadn't have done this, I would not have done that. I hear that all the time. They said it first. They started it. But you see, we get to control ourselves. I probably say this phrase more than any other phrase. I catch myself saying it all the time to other people even is, you can't control them. You can only control you. It's personal responsibility. That's what God has called us to do. It's our choice how we will act. I mean, you know the old saying, the devil made me do it. We're even blaming him for what we chose. We'll find anybody to blame. Oh, he made me do it. And that's not true. God has called us to be responsible for ourselves. No one makes us do anything. And we choose to do it, and this ties right into politics and society in general. I think many people have abdicated what we should be doing personally to the government. The sad fact is, many people have allowed others to raise their kids, provide for their living, and then ultimately make them feel like they have no choices in life. And I think that this is terrible how people won't take responsibility for themselves and their family. I mean, I totally agree. We think that, we should have responsibility. So many people have abdicated all these different things to the government. But what is even worse than that is when we have abdicated our personal responsibility in the church. And so we're clear, the word abdicated, it literally means to fall short, to reject, to not fulfill. So we have rejected, basically, our responsibility in the church. And we'll say, oh man, it is terrible that these people only, let somebody else raise their kids, or they rely on somebody else to take care of them. And that is probably not a positive thing, but it's even worse when we've abdicated our job in the church. Here's why. Abdicating personal responsibility to the government is a problem, but it is temporary. Abdicating our personal responsibility as a Christian is eternal. It's eternal. If we give up what we're supposed to do as Christians and our own responsibility, it's eternal. For example, when was the last time you personally shared Jesus with someone? Because here's what's going to happen. We're going to go to the polls, and many of us, I understand where I live, many of us are going to go, and we're going to vote for personal responsibility. And we're going to vote that this person should be taking care of themselves, they should be taking care of their family, and more than likely that's probably the direction many people are going to vote, and yet we will not take personal responsibility as Christians. Because as Christians, our personal responsibility is to share Jesus. So when was the last time you shared Jesus with someone? When was the last time you had a serious prayer time with God? When was the last time you sat down and read God's word? So those are not just the job of the pastors. We've been so indoctrinated with this idea of government or organizations taking the place of our personal responsibility that we have chosen not to actively live out a life of commitment to God. We believe it is someone else's job to pray. It is someone else's job to reach people. It is someone else's job to teach the kids on Sunday. The pastor will teach me a little bit of Bible on Sunday morning in the sermon, and that's enough. And often we get caught in that trap of not taking personal responsibility for our spiritual life. And then we get in this bad place and we think somehow that God is to blame. I say this all the time because this is such a big issue. I have people come and say, I don't feel God. Of course you don't feel God. You've not chosen to live as a Christian. You've chosen to follow part of what God says. You've chosen to only do a little bit of it. You don't feel God because you have not taken personal responsibility to grow as a Christian. You see, that is what God has called us to do. We think Christianity is a good idea, but we only follow part of the plan. And when you only follow part of the plan, it doesn't work. You know what I'm talking about. When you get the instructions out, and guys, you get about halfway through and you're like, I don't need these anymore. And then you have leftover parts. I know all these things always send leftover parts, right, guys? You don't need all those pieces. And then it doesn't work out the way you thought, and then you go dig the directions back out of the trash, and you come back and you're like, yeah, this isn't working right. And we do that with Christianity. We're like, I only want this part and this part. That part, and I don't think I'm going to invest in as much. And then we're like, this is not working out the way I thought it was going to work out. I don't feel God, and God's not moving in my life, and I'm still got all these anger issues, and I'm still got all these struggles. Well, that's because we've only chosen part of it. We haven't chosen to be personally responsible for growing in God. You see, this is where personal accountability for your relationship with God comes into play. It is not the church's job to, quote unquote, feed you spiritually. Some people have that idea that they come to church and that's where they get fed spiritually. You know, people, they come for a while and then they go, well, you know what, that church just isn't feeding me. I'm going to go over here to this church and they're going to feed me. And then after a little while they go, well, yeah, I'm not getting fed here either. I'm going to go over here. The problem isn't the church. The problem is when you only eat once a week, you starve to death. That's the problem. And so you've got to feed yourself. It is our job to feed ourselves spiritually. The church is simply here to help. You see, it's not the church's fault. And it's not the government's fault we have struggles. We have all had the same opportunities of everyone else. Some people are having financial struggles, and it is not the government's fault. When we were young, we all made choices. We made choices of what career we would do. We made choices of what trade we would learn. And whatever you think would be a good job for you, you could have done that. Or you still can. We get to make choices. But we get to choose, and our choices today lead to where we are later in life. The problem in life often is that we follow our own wisdom and we make choices based on our own wisdom. Proverbs 3 says this, though. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. I cannot tell you how many times something has come into my head and I thought, that's a really good idea. It's a really good idea. I think about it, pray about it, and then I realize that is not a good idea. Not a good idea. Because I was using my wisdom, not God's. And I realized that God says this, and I'm like, this makes a lot of sense to me though, God. I really think this is what we should do. And I realized that God says, it doesn't matter if it makes sense to you or not. This is what I have told you to do. And lots of things make sense to me that is not necessarily God's way. There are many verses in the Bible, I'll be honest, I wish they were not there because that means I have to follow them. I wish they weren't in there. But God's plan is always the right plan. So when we're making choices, that's the plan we follow. And that is why the answer to any of our problems, regardless of what they are, is Jesus. And I know that sounds awfully simplistic, but stay with me for a minute. 1 Corinthians 13:11 says this. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. You might be thinking to yourself, what does that have to do with anything? Here's what it has to do with it. It is telling us that when we become believers, we change our way of thinking. We no longer blame people. We look in the mirror. I love John Maxwell. He's a leadership writer, author. Love his stuff. If you ever want leadership books, I got a bunch of them. I love it. He always says this. When things go right, you look out the mirror, which basically means you give the praise to the people that are working for you. But when things go wrong, did I say mirror? When you look out the window, you look out the window. When things go wrong, when things go right, you look out the window. When things go wrong, you look in the mirror and you look at yourself. So when things are good, you look out the window and you go, yes, praise to the people that are doing all the work. They're doing a good job. When things go wrong, you look in the mirror and you realize, I'm the problem. What do I need to fix? I don't start blaming people. You see, what Jesus is telling us is this, that when we become believers, our way of thinking changes. We put the worldly ways behind. We've moved beyond those things because we have God in our lives. And moving beyond our own wisdom and childish things means we don't blame anyone, including God, for our situation. It means we take responsibility as a Christian for sharing our faith with those around us. We take responsibility for our own spiritual growth. We take responsibility for how we represent God to people. We act like Christians, not whiny adults. Or not like, I'm not speaking well today. We act like Christian adults, not whiny children. We act like Christian adults, not whiny children. We don't point. My kids love to blame somebody else. You know why? Because they're children. Because they are children. They do not want to take responsibility for what they did. But he says we've moved deep beyond that. We see Jesus teaching about these choices we get to make. Jesus pointed to the fact that we get to decide what will happen in our lives. I mean, he has a parable in Matthew 25, and you probably know this parable where there's 3 servants and they each get a little bit of money. And the guy says, I'm going to leave. When I get back, I'm going to see what you did with it. And they all come to him, and 2 of them, they increased it. They doubled the amount of money, basically, that they had. And they said, look at what we did. One of them didn't do that. And this is what happens. The 2 that did well, this is what Jesus said to them. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. And then the one who didn't do anything with it, the master said this. You wicked, lazy servant, you could have at least put it in the bank to get interest. Basically, you chose to not do anything with what you were given, and here are the consequences to those choices. And here's how that ended, that section. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Why was it like that? Why did the 2 get praised and the 1 get punished? Because they had choices they got to make with what God had given them. We get choices all the time. We get choices of what we're going to do, who we're going to talk to, how we are going to live. And we can choose to use our wisdom, or we can choose to use God's. Jesus uses this analogy. Matthew 17:20, he says this. Because you have so little faith, truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. We get to choose how much faith we will have. God doesn't say, you know what, you're only going to get that much faith, and you're only going to get that much faith, and that's about it. We get to choose how much faith we want to have in God. I want you to think for a second. You know, growing up or as an adult, you've met some people, and you know somebody who, when you think of a Christian person, when you think of a God follower, that person's picture pops up into your head. Well, they did not get there by accident. They got there by daily making choices. They made choices every single day that built their spiritual life to get them to a place where you look at them and you know them and you think to yourself, oh, that's a man of God. That's a woman of God. That's somebody that loves them. It's because of daily choices that we make. We get to choose how much faith we have in God. I mean, there's so many more where Jesus talks about choices. The Good Samaritan, we get to choose to have mercy. The lost chapter. Luke 15, we get to choose to go find the lost. We get to choose all of those things. And here's what's so cool about this. Because of those choices, we get to choose exactly how powerful God is in our life. We get to choose how powerful God is in our life. We get to choose how powerful God will be in our community by what we choose to do. And if you get nothing else out of today, I want you to get this. Christianity is not a reactionary faith just to save ourselves. Christianity is a proactive faith to save the world. That's why our choices matter. That is why our choices matter. We get to choose to bring Jesus to people. He is the answer to the problem. But we too often want to sit back and let someone else do our job. We want to let a group, a government, a church do what we are responsible for individually. But since the beginning of time, God has said, you are free to do what you want. Just know that there's both immediate and long-term consequences for those choices. And too many of us use our human wisdom and not God's, and that's why we are where we are at. Why are there so many difficult issues in our country? It's because people need Jesus. It's not because we have this issue or this issue. It's because people need Jesus. And our choices have not helped them get to that spot where they have Jesus. That's what happens. Our choices move people's heart. And if we just changed more hearts, then many of the issues we struggle with as a country would go away. The answer is Jesus, and it is our personal responsibility to make sure that people see him in charge of our life and share him with others. I can't stress this enough. My choices affect other people's relationship with God. Your choices affect other people's relationship with God. Now, that could be friends, that could be family. It especially is true for your kids. Especially true for your kids. Your choices and how you raise them, what is important to you, what you teach them, creates what is going to happen in the future. What are they going to choose? And so it is so important for us. Our choices today make a difference in eternity. So I guess really the question is, what in the world does this have to do with how we vote? What does this have to do with how we vote? First is this. We as Christians have to vote for personal responsibility. Whenever there's something on the ballot and one takes away responsibility and the other adds responsibility to the individual, as Christians, we vote for personal responsibility. That's the only way things work, is for each of us to take responsibility for ourselves and for our household. That means we deal with the choices we make. We don't try to pass the responsibility on to others. We vote for governmental policies that promote individual responsibility. Now, that doesn't mean we don't care for each other, and that doesn't mean we don't help people in difficult times. But like I said earlier, when someone buys an $800 iPhone, it's not my job to help them with rent. That's not how it works. You see, personal responsibility is the key. We vote for policies that force people to be accountable for themselves. But second, and most importantly, is this. We have to be examples of taking responsibility. We have to be examples of that. We cannot vote for personal responsibility and then abdicate our own personal responsibility as Christ followers. It rings hollow. It rings hollow to people that see us and hear us. We have a personal responsibility first as citizens of heaven to share Jesus and pray for God's power in the world. That is our responsibility. And I cannot, in good conscience, vote and say, you need to be responsible for this and this and this, and then me not do my part. Me not do what God has told me to do as a Christian. You see, pre-Christians know that we are supposed to share Jesus. So if we don't take the responsibility to do that, then they also know that we are not committed to our faith. Do you want to know the biggest issue between left and right? The biggest issue between left and right is hypocrisy. That's what it is. That there would be more people that would vote certain ways if it was not for the hypocrisy on the other side. Because they see it and they go, oh, you say this, but then you do this. Oh, you say this, but then this is how you live. You see, we have to take personal responsibility. Responsibility for our failures. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than when someone admits they were wrong. That is healing in all relationships, especially in the home. We take personal responsibility to work and to contribute in society and in the church. We take personal responsibility to pray and to study God's word for ourselves. We take personal responsibility to let the world know we follow a God that loves us and lets us choose him in every area of our life. That is what this world needs right now. Christians who live what they say they believe and are personally accountable to God. And my hope and prayer is right now, if you thought to yourself, how am I accountable to God? You would say, I'm 100% accountable to God. But if you're like me, and you began to reflect on this past week, and as I was studying, I would realize I'm not 100% accountable to God. There are areas that I need to be more accountable to God, that I need to grow so that I am personally responsible for my own faith. I am personally responsible for the outcomes of what is going to happen. That's what this world needs. It needs Christians who are personally accountable to God. Here's the great thing about it is we are going to give you that opportunity today to make the choice to be on God's side and to take responsibility for your own eternity. You're not going to be saved because your grandpa was a Baptist preacher. Everybody has a grandpa, I think, that was a Baptist preacher. You're not going to get saved because your mama was a Christian. You're not going to get saved because you're here today. That's not why you get saved. You see, it's on you. It's personal accountability. It's up to you to make the decision for Jesus. It's up to you to say, I'm going to let God be in charge. And here's the thing. I know there's people here today that have made poor choices in their past. Some have made a lot of poor choices, some a few, but some people made some poor choices. And maybe, you are struggling with the guilt. Maybe you're struggling with anger. Maybe you're struggling just with sadness of what all these decisions have gotten you into and where you are at now. Here's the cool thing about this. You can accept God, and all of your sins are gone, and you know where your eternity is. Now, granted, you may still have to deal with the temporary issues of your choices, but you can know where your eternity is, regardless of the choices you've made in the past, because God says there's only one choice that matters. The one choice that matters is choosing me. We call that getting on base with God. The B is to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. A is to admit that I'm a sinner. S is to surrender and say, God, you are in charge. I've made you my choice. And E is to express that in Christian baptism. And you get to make that choice today. It is up to you personally whether you will choose to be accountable to God or not. Now, I know many here have already made that decision, and so we have a mission this week, as we always do, and here is our mission for this week. It is to look at our lives and see where we need to take more personal responsibility. Maybe it's in our Christian habits. Maybe it is in sharing Jesus with others. Maybe it is in how we react to others when they treat us bad. Maybe that's where we need to be accountable. But we can only control ourselves. We can't control anyone else. And if we as Christians live consistently with personal responsibility in our faith and in our words, in our lives, and in our homes, then we would see people voting for Jesus in their lives because of our example. You see, we vote for personal accountability, and we live like we are followers of God. And when we do that, and when we are personally accountable to God, and we live like that, then we will see people come to Jesus, and we will see the world being changed, and we will know that see people voting for Jesus to be in charge of their life as well. Let's pray.